So the talk for today will be about the impacts of long COVID on patients' quality of life. And I'd just like to start by, giving a background to this talk in terms of the COVID situation itself. So we know that long COVID has been affecting numerous people worldwide. And currently, there are over 500 million confirmed cases, with more than 6 million deaths worldwide. And of these numbers, we know that the majority go on to full recovery, while up to 1 in 5 would have symptoms for more than 5 weeks, and 1 in 10 may have symptoms lasting 12 weeks plus. And these persistent symptoms and the complications that come hand in hand impact on individuals' quality of life. In the UK, the estimate is that we have up to 1.8 million people who are experiencing self-reported long COVID. And the fact is, it's a multi-systemic condition, and it affects all the systems in the body. So it affects the breathing, the pulmonary, the cardiac, the intestines, the brains, every part of the body can be affected. And so we have, numerous symptoms that may actually be experienced by people. Some time ago, last year, we conducted a review to look into the symptoms that people might have, with long COVID. And this has been published, and it has been shared and disseminated widely. From that review, what we found is that whilst there are so many symptoms that people could experience, like 200 or more symptoms, the top 10 symptoms that commonly occurred were these which we've highlighted here. So fatigue being the most common, difficulty with breathing is the next, and then pain, cough, headache, joint pains, chest pains, problems with smell, intestinal problems like diarrhea, and problems with taste. However, people could experience different symptoms, not just these ones that have been listed. So other symptoms that commonly are experienced include brain fog, problems with memory loss, problems with sleep, awareness of chest, of heartbeat, sore throat, and less commonly at that time, things like runny nose, sneezing, and of course, rarely problems with seizures, incontinence, and also things like hearing loss and hair loss. Of course, we do know now that each strain of COVID has different types of symptoms that are at the forefront. So what are the lived experiences of COVID, long COVID to be specific? Some time ago, there was a focus group by some members of the long COVID Facebook group, where people shared their experiences of what it means to live with long COVID. And 4 themes came out of that focus group, including the expectations, the journey with the symptoms, the feeling of being doubted by not just clinicians, but even work colleagues, family members, and society as a whole, and the available support at that time. We know now that long COVID takes different parts for different people. So we have people who have recurring symptoms. Some it's waxing and waning, so it comes and then resolves only to come again. Whereas some people just experience a new set of symptoms from what they experienced during the acute phase of the COVID-19 infection itself. And one thing that struck me when I looked at this particular website, which I've shown the link, is that people said they needed to learn how to lower their expectations of recovery. and also gain realistic goals and pace themselves, which was the way they could move forward. And I think that will probably resonate with a number of people who are listening today. So impacts, in terms of impacts of long COVID, on people, it was shown from the studies that we reviewed that, regardless of the severity and even whether people were hospitalized or not, there were impacts on quality of life, on mental health, and also on employment. And there were several studies that showed that, persistently, people experienced reductions in quality of life at 6 months follow-up and even beyond 6 months. So we're talking of a year or more. Specifically now, when it comes to impacts, there were impacts on activities. So people experienced limitations in the way they're able to carry out their day-to-day activities. And a particular study reported that up to 70% reported a limitation in their everyday life. There was a study in people who engage in sports before having COVID, and up to a third could not return to their physical activities and their sports after 3 months. And even those who were able to return had to return by doing less. So they were not able to go back to what they used to do. And again, I'm sure people would recognize this as one of the common impacts for most people with long COVID. There were also impacts on mental health. And a particular study found that at 8 weeks after the first infection, nearly half of the patients had emotional issues brought on by the experience of long COVID. And even some had to have further mental health care. Some people go on to develop post-traumatic stress, which is a condition where people have undergone severe or significant experiences, which have then gone on to affect them emotionally and psychologically. And it was found that lack of social support was linked to the chance of developing PTSD and also the severity of the PTSD. And also social stigmatization and discrimination, which occurs in some communities, influence the severity of these PTSD symptoms. And then, so the next thing, apologies for the heading, you were supposed to talk about employment. In terms of employment, there were people, up to 40% could not return to work within 8 weeks of discharge in a particular study. And that is a significant number of people. And of those who were able to return to work, a quarter of them had to reduce their working hours or change the duties at work. And also another study found that nearly 70% of those who were previously hospitalized were unable to return to work at 3 months. So this showed, and discussions with people within our PPI group has also shown that this is the case for many people. Ability to return to work is a significant issue for most people. And the impact of long COVID, on this was significant. People just complained about the fact that they could not go back to work or go back to what they used to do in terms of work. And this has implications for finances for people. So having then to look for support in terms of government support financially, which was difficult, I think, at the very beginning of the pandemic. So I'd like to stop here for now and say thank you very much for listening. The recordings, so we've had the first seminar, which was recorded, and we would shortly provide the recordings for that one, as well as this seminar. There's the patient webinar, which will take place on the 27th of June, and it will be good for people to attend that, to listen firsthand to the experiences of our patient partners with their long COVID journey. I haven't gone too much into the symptoms and the risk factors for long COVID today, because there's a particular session, the next session, which would be on the 20th of June, that would explore this much further. The patient webinar is for the 27th of June. I would like to thank everybody who's come today to listen to the webinar. I would like to thank our patient partners, the PPI group, members of Long COVID SOS, Long COVID Support, Long COVID Wales, and Long COVID Scotland, and everybody else who's participated and contributed in one way or the other. If you would like to check on some of these things I've discussed, there's a list of references here as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lee. That was a really helpful overview of some of the symptoms and complications and health impacts from long COVID, which I hope attendees found useful, and thank you also for sharing the references. So my name is Dr. Shamal Haroon. I co-lead the Therapies for Long COVID study with Professor Mel Calvert. So I'd just like to open the session now for some questions. I did see a couple of questions in the Q&A box, so thank you very much for those who did post those questions, and I'm happy to answer any further ones, and we've got other members of our team who are also here, who I'm sure would be also happy to answer questions. Could I just check, Christelle, are we just taking questions through the chat, or are we also having the opportunity for attendees to speak their questions out?
I'm not sure if I can unmute them. I think I can, but yeah, if they want to start with the chat, and let's see how I can unmute them.
The Q&A box, not a chat.
Q&A box, sorry, Q&A box. Thanks
for clarifying that. So if you could just type out your question in the Q&A box, and we'll collectively try our best to answer your questions. So there was a question about whether COVID hijacks the trauma pathways already established in the brain. I can't answer that directly, but we do know that there are many effects of COVID-19 on the brain, and those effects are quite different from person to person. So one of the common symptoms that people report that Lee mentioned was brain fog, and that seems to be one of the most common brain effects of having long COVID. But we also know that people with long COVID frequently report having quite significant levels of anxiety, which sometimes is related to the effects of having these often very debilitating symptoms. Sometimes it's also related to having that initial infection as well. And this is particularly true for those who were very severely acutely infected, particularly those who've been to the intensive care unit. And they often experience something called post-intensive care syndrome. And this is a very well recognized syndrome which occurs following a stay at ICU, because it's clearly quite a traumatic event. And this can cause substantial mental health consequences. And for some people with long COVID, there will be a group of them, particularly those who were hospitalized, who will be experiencing a post-ICU syndrome, which is really related to the trauma of having had such a significant illness and being hospitalized. Not much is known specifically about COVID hijacking the trauma pathways that I'm aware of, but hopefully that answers the question. But please let me know if you need any further clarification on that. I'm not sure if anyone else from the team wanted to add anything to what I've said. I don't know, Lee, did you want to add to what I've said?
Oh, thanks. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that there's still work being done. So hopefully some of these questions in terms of the pathways would be, clearer as time goes on.
And one of the things that we are capturing as part of the TLC study is some of the mental health symptoms that people experience and how that changes over time. So thank you for that question. So the next question is that, so I'll just read out the question. I really think this is key to the effects on the body, is how it affects this gland, I think meaning the pituitary gland, as through this pathway, everything is affected: hormones, regulation, nervous system, immune system. Please look into this area, please. Yeah, so there are a number of groups looking at the effects of COVID on brain function, not specifically the pituitary gland, but looking at the brain function in general. I haven't seen that much about hormonal regulation. There was certainly an interest in hormonal regulation earlier on in the pandemic when people were trying to understand some of the differences between how COVID affected males compared to females, and men were typically affected worse during the acute infection compared to women. But interestingly, women seem to be affected worse in terms of long COVID compared to men. And whether that is hormonally regulated is a really interesting and potentially very useful line of inquiry. We're not actually in a position to measure the hormone levels in our study. We're not sort of funded to do that, but it's certainly something we can look at for future studies to see how hormonal regulation may play a role. And perhaps this would potentially explain some of the reasons why there are differences between men and women. So the next question is, do you think inflammation causes issues of multisystem, and vitamin deficiencies and gut microbiome imbalance could cause malfunction? So as I had 80 symptoms, I got it down to 3, by replacing vitamins and minerals and probiotics, including my nervous system. So as Lee pointed out, long COVID is clearly a multi-system condition. The reasons why it's multi-system are probably because of the way that the virus infects the human body. So the virus itself attacks cells using something called the ACE2 receptor. And this receptor is expressed throughout the body in many different organs and tissues throughout the body. And therefore the virus is able to infect cells pretty much in every organ system. And that's one of the reasons why it's multi-system. Another reason is that the virus, the acute infection, and potentially the long-term effects are potentially related to this inflammatory response. So the body launches inflammation pathways, which then can cause damage to tissues, particularly if that inflammation goes on longer than needed. So inflammation is a very important part of responding to an infection, but when you get too much inflammation, it can cause problems. There's a number of research studies which do show sort of widespread inflammation following COVID-19 infection, which may be one of the reasons why multiple organs are affected. And there's many other pathways as well. We're still trying to understand what causes long COVID. And there's many other theories about why different systems in the body are affected. One particular pathway that we're interested in our study is whether the body launches antibodies against itself following the initial infection. So one of the things we plan to do in the TLC study is to measure antibodies in people who've had long COVID and compare them to people who've not had long COVID to see what differences there are. And one of our theories is that long COVID, at least in some people, is related to a phenomenon called autoimmunity, which is when your body launches antibodies against yourself, against your own tissues, rather than against bad bugs that have infected you. And we see that in conditions like rheumatoid arthritis, where the body produces antibodies against the body's own tissues, which causes inflammation of the joints. And those conditions tend to wax and wane, as Lee described, which is what we see in long COVID as well. And interestingly, those conditions tend to occur more commonly in women than men. So that's a certain line of inquiry which we're particularly interested in looking at, because if we do find that there's a degree of autoimmune antibodies being produced, then there are potential therapies that we can target. In terms of vitamin deficiencies, one of the key vitamins that many people in the general population are deficient in is vitamin D, which is why the NHS recommend almost everyone supplement themselves with vitamin D daily, particularly during the winter months, because we get so little sunlight in the UK. Now, one of the important things about vitamin D is that it also regulates your immune system. So we all know about vitamin D affecting your bones, and it's very important for bone growth. But it also regulates your immune system. And when you're low in vitamin D, there's a lot of evidence that shows that you become more prone to infections, including respiratory infections. And certainly, I think the general recommendation from the NHS is to have vitamin D supplements, particularly during the winter. And it's possible that being deficient in vitamin D might lead to an increased risk of being infected with the virus that causes COVID-19, although there's still a little bit of differences of opinion about how important that is. So just following on from that question about the gut microbiome imbalance, this is an area which we don't have an answer for. We know the gut microbiome is incredibly important for many, many different conditions. We know that the gut microbiome has a big role to play in our overall health, including chronic conditions. And whether or not it's affected by COVID-19, we just don't know. I don't think the studies are really there to tell us whether the gut microbiome plays a role, and whether there's a role for probiotics in dealing with that. We do know that there's a range of gut symptoms associated with COVID-19. As Lee pointed out, people do experience abdominal pain, diarrhea, and things like that following the infection. But we do know that the ACE2 receptor, which I mentioned before, that the virus uses to infect cells, is actually expressed quite widely in the intestine. And that is likely to be the mechanism by which you get the gut symptoms. Why those symptoms should last for long periods of time, we really don't know. And you know, as I said before, there's many different theories about why people get long COVID. One of them is that the virus persists in some people, and it could well be that the virus is still persisting in the intestine of people who've got these symptoms. So I hope that answers that particular question. So there is another question which I will just move on to, if that's okay. So there was a question about giving an update on the study. So explaining that you're measuring immunological, proteomic, and microRNA biomarkers to determine the underlying pathogenesis. And will we make any recommendations on pharmacological therapies? So thanks very much for that question. So one of the studies that we are doing as part of the TLC study is called the BioAware sub-study. And what we'll be doing there is measuring a range of markers of the immune system. So I mentioned autoantibodies as one of them. We're also measuring proteins in the blood of people who've had long COVID and getting them assessed. So there's quite a lot of proteins that we can measure. There's about 5,000 different ones, and they are related to markers of organ damage in different parts of the body. And so that's a part of the study which we're still in the process of setting up. We hope to be able to to do this analysis on about 300 people, 200 of whom have long COVID and 100 who we're using as a comparison group. We believe that being able to get a better understanding of the immune system of people who have long COVID will help us to see whether there are particular drug targets that can be used to improve symptoms. As I mentioned before, one of the areas we're particularly interested in is whether the body in people with long COVID are launching these autoantibodies or antibodies that attack human cells. And if so, whether we can treat that with the same treatments that we use for autoimmune conditions like rheumatoid arthritis and similar conditions. So that's something we will be very interested in looking at, and we hope that we will be able to complete that study by the, or at least recruitment for that study by the end of the year. In terms of recommendations on pharmacological therapies, as I said, from understanding the immune system of people who've got long COVID, we hope we'll be able to make some recommendations about drug treatments which could potentially be beneficial. At the moment, there's a number of different studies that are ongoing throughout the UK looking at drug therapies. So one of them is called Heal COVID that Professor Mel Calvert is a part of, which is looking at the use of blood thinners in people with long COVID, because as I mentioned before, there's many different theories about why people get long COVID. One of those theories is that people with long COVID develop sticky blood, and which forms clots more easily than people who've not had long COVID. And there are a number of studies that show that people who've had the infection that causes COVID-19 go on to develop blood clotting problems like clots in the legs and clots in the lungs. And some of the symptoms may be related to those, to clotting issues. And so in Heal COVID, they're actually doing a trial where they're looking at the effectiveness of using blood thinners in people who are seen in the outpatient clinic following infection with COVID-19. So that's certainly one of the drug therapies that is being looked at in the UK. There's also a number of other drugs which are being looked at by other groups as well. We are not ourselves focusing on drug trials. We're looking specifically at non-drug treatments because we know that there are many people who have a lot of really significant symptoms who are needing support with that. So the focus of our of the interventions that we're looking at within the TLC study are the non-drug ones, but there are many other groups that are specifically looking at drug therapies. So I hope that answers that question. So there was one other question about, does COVID cause viruses and diseases that were not active to become active, for example, shingles? So this is a great question. I'll try and very quickly answer it because we've got to wrap up shortly. So it's possible. I don't think we know that. I think one potential area that people are interested in is the virus that causes glandular fever, Epstein-Barr virus, because many people are infected with it. And there is a theory that that people get long COVID because of reactivation of this particular virus. Again, it's something we don't really have much data on. So I wouldn't be able to tell you, but it's certainly a line of inquiry that groups, other research groups will be looking into.